So today we're going to talk about three things, but all revolving around the traditional process of going into the three main careers in healthcare. And it's not everything, but we'll be talking about going into the field of what we call traditionally medicine, being a physician. We'll also talk about nursing, and we'll talk about being a physician's assistant and how that works from when you start in high school, where you are today, and what it looks like generally, broadly. And I think one thing that's important to note is that everyone's experience through these different processes is very different. The overall kind of overarching things that you do are roughly the same. You have to fill certain requirements, you have to do certain things, you have to get admitted here, there, so on and so forth. But keep in mind that this is just an overall idea, right? And then one thing I want to mention before we get started, I'm going to talk about the traditional pathway to medicine. And I know I've spoken to some of you about the route of the combined degree programs, BSMD programs specifically. So that's something we'll talk about at a later date. There's a meeting scheduled for that in the end of this month, I believe. It's in Schoology. So just so you know, we're talking about the traditional path, starting in high school. How do we end up in the career, in a healthcare career? And so we're going to start with the medical route. And I'm just going to refer to anything with becoming a physician as medicine, okay, going into medicine. So this, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. Being in FHP, of course, is this very good starting point to what is healthcare? What does it mean to go into healthcare? And really getting a broad perspective. I think one thing that it's easy to become very narrow focused. I remember I was having a conversation with one of the admissions officers for one BSMD program. And he says, we have students who come in and they say, I am going to be a cardiologist, a cardiothoracic surgeon, and specialize in the left ventricle. And just to give you, some perspective, obviously that's the extreme end of it. But the fact that, he mentioned that is something to be interesting to look at, how open-minded you need to be when you approach what it means to go into healthcare, right? Okay, I think the basic. I'm going to go really briefly. Biology, chemistry, physics, the basic science courses that if you enjoy them, then that's good, right? That's what medical school, undergrad and medical school are not easy. And so gotta love what you're doing. Okay. And then one thing I think that's underappreciated and something that Dan and I have both been going through this BSMD process, right? Which is, for those of you who aren't aware, BSMD is like a program where you apply and you are in 4 years of undergrad plus 4 years of med school, guaranteed seat. So these kind of things have been accelerated a little bit for us. Knowing why you're interested in medicine, trying to think about how to articulate that is something that you don't need to have, like this perfect refined answer like you're going to need when you apply to medical school 4 years down the line, 6 years down the line, depending on how old you are now. But have an idea, what is it about medicine that you like? And I think trying to write that down gives you a good idea, and it'll change. It'll develop as you go on. But I think that's a really good basis to start in high school. Okay. So what does your next 4 years after you graduate high school look like? There is a lot that goes into applying to medical school. If you know some of the top universities for college, for undergrad, have acceptance rates of like, I think Stanford's like the lowest, right? 4%. All right. And you end up going, all the Ivies end up in that single digit range, usually top 50 colleges are in that 20% range, which are considered highly selective colleges. Well, the average acceptance rate of a med school in the nation is 7%. Give you some perspective, there's a lot that goes into applying to medical school. And so to kind of hit you with, what does that mean for in your undergraduate years? You have 4 years, really kind of three years and a half. Just like you do in high school, right? Applying to college. You have to fill certain requirements for courses. And we'll get to that on the next slide. Just as you do in high school. If you want to major in college, if you want to major in a biology class, right? You probably would have taken biology courses in high school. However, for undergrad going to medical school, there are requirements because when you get into medical school, you need to know the fundamentals, right? Um, the big things they always say are the most important is your GPA. Okay, I can't remember the exact average GPA, but it's on the high, 3.6 plus, 3.7 plus GPA scale for the more competitive medical schools that you'd be applying to. And so there's 150 medical schools for the MD program that you can apply to. It's just over that, I think, just over 150 to give you some perspective. Okay, and then the MCAT is something that you may have heard of, the Medical College Admissions Test. This is like the SAT of applying to medical school, and you might have heard this word being thrown around. This tests your, fundamental science skills. All right, and there are 4 sections, and we'll go into that a little bit. But mostly fundamental science skills: how well you know biochemistry, orgo, biology, molecular biology, so on and so forth. And this is all preclinical, right? So you don't necessarily start learning about how to treat and diagnose a patient in undergrad, right? And so that's not really tested on the MCAT as much as those actual fundamental science knowledge. Okay. The next thing I want to mention is the Casper. This is something that medical schools have been starting to use increasingly, and you take it in the same time frame as your MCAT. Kind of like, SAT, ACT, you can think of, well, not exactly, because MCAT is science, whereas Casper is personal skills. If you remember, we had a meeting where we did some sample Casper questions. So if you remember that gives you some perspective in you are being asked questions that test how well you think critically, but also your, what they maybe call emotional intelligence, your ability to interact with people, your ability to deal with really difficult situations. And all of those pieces are equally important to having that science knowledge, having that high GPA in your classes with the Casper. Okay, next thing, letter of recommendation. I think it's usually around 3 to 4 letters of recommendation from what the literature says for most of these med schools. So it's something you want to keep in mind as you jump into undergrad. And if you're, in high school now, getting your letters of recommendation are equally important for applying to college. But the weightage is a lot greater with these medical school applications as well, right? So when I think if you coming here and saying, I'm here for, what is the process of the medical education? What are the things to remember? Well, make strong connections with people, everyone. And I think that's something that is, again, underappreciated. It's easy to sit in a classroom and just listen to a teacher talk, but when you start interacting with them, when you start interacting with the research colleagues, when you start interacting with physicians, having those conversations and interactions really builds that rapport and that reputation, and that holds a lot of value when it comes to letters of recommendation, as you would presume. And I think that's the one thing that's kind of a little bit different from all the other things on this list, in that it's something that is very variable. Okay. Then the next kind of 5 things are all, I think, what we think is very traditional of what do you do outside of just your academics, right? Well, extracurriculars, that's the kind of broad area, but not just medical extracurriculars. Do things that are genuinely interesting to you. And that also ties into when you think about what you're going to study in undergrad, you don't necessarily have to just pick a major that's in medicine. There are a lot of people, and they're saying, more and more that medical schools tend to prefer students who choose something out of their interest as opposed to just medicine. Of course, if you love, biology, biochemistry, like I'm majoring in biochem, do that. But also keep in mind that if you feel like, you're more interested in majoring in something else, then go for it. And one of the big things about medical school is that they keep shifting towards this idea of you want a really well-rounded student. And so this comes down to all these experiences that you have, right? Your shadowing experiences, your non-medical extracurriculars, research experience is huge. Being in a lab, working with a professor. Another thing that ties into letter of recommendation from that research mentor, or what they call a PI, principal investigator, who runs the lab. Clinical experiences and shadowing are similar, but also that level of patient interaction, right? I personally like hospice is the example that I like to use because that's, patient interaction right up front. And the last thing is volunteer experience, medical and non-medical, again, right? So I'm not going to go into too much detail because, again, these things are so variable for each individual person, what you want to do, but know that they're all so important. So your undergraduate years are very, very busy with a lot of different things to create that, you learn a lot, but also become that well-rounded student that, first of all, you should be very proud of being, going through all these experiences and making your timetables and doing everything. But also that medical schools really look at in a positive light. One thing I want to note also is that the average age of entry to medical school is 24 years old. Okay. And what that means, gives you some perspective, is that you usually finish undergrad at the age of 22, right? 4 years, 18 to 22, which means on average, there are 2 gap years that students take before applying to medical school. Now, what does that mean? What do they do with these gap years? Well, that's different for every person. Some people do research. Some people go to different countries, serve the underserved populations in different areas, either domestic or international, or they learn something else. Maybe they get a master's degree. But the fact that med schools tend to admit these kids who are older, well, I guess they're not kids, students who are older applying to medical school, tells you how important this well-roundedness is, and how it's going to be. I think you should think of it differently than applying to undergrad out of high school, because you usually don't. There are students who take gap years between high school and undergrad, but taking 2 gap years on average is something I think that's testament very much, and what they say in the admissions to this well-roundedness aspect. Okay. So here's just a list briefly on the left here of the prerequisite courses that you have to take in undergrad for almost every medical school. I'm sure that's not surprising in any way, shape, or form. The natural sciences, of course, organic chemistry, biochemistry, those are more medical oriented, you might say. And then that serves the fundamentals for what you learn in your first year of medical school, right? And so that's the idea, you're prepared for all of that. On the right, here is the distribution for all the MCAT total score. The MCAT is out of 528. That is the highest score you can get. And so if you see, you have the percent of students who score in each score on the MCAT, right? So very, very few people end up with that 528. Unlike where you have the SAT, I'm sure you might know students who are maybe the curve would be shifted higher, right? For example, for students who are applying to top schools, right? You have a lot of students who are on the top end. Whereas just an idea is that the MCAT, the idea is not to, be in that perfect percentile. I think the 80th percentile, which means if you score better than 80% of everyone who took the MCAT, let's say given year 2020, 2021, you would be in that 80th percentile, which is a 512, 513 this year. Okay. And then you can see again in the graphic that the mean score, the average score, is a 501. So gives you some idea. Okay. And then again, the acceptance rate numbers there. I always think that's very interesting. When we look at top schools, it's kind of intimidating, right? It's like, look at how small their acceptance rates are. And then you see medical school, you have a huge number of applicants, very competitive applicants, right? And a very small number of positions that they accept, especially compared to undergrad, right? So even the IBs and the top schools, I say IBs generally. Okay, good. So here's kind of an idea of what 4 years of undergrad, kind of like the minimum might look like. And the ones that are like kind of research experience, clinical experiences, that's more broad and more variable. But of course, focusing on your coursework, you got to have a high GPA, right? You hear that in high school, I'm sure all the time. Same thing with undergrad. And I think the major of interest is really important. And I think I've hit that quite a bit. So have an idea of what you care about. It doesn't just have to be medicine. And I think really it's looked well upon to have those different multifaceted interests. Okay. Getting into extracurriculars as you are now, I think you all know very well how to get involved and stay active and be involved with those things that you care about, that you're interested in, right? Just like you do in high school. One thing that I think is interesting that we don't really have at Barrington to the same extent is this idea of pre-med advising. Being able to have that asset in different schools, have different programs for how they do pre-med advising. You might have one person that you can go see. I think most schools work like that. But the larger the school you go to, It's a little bit different. Smaller school you go to, it's a little bit different. The program in particular, how many pre-med kids are in that particular school, something to consider, but at least you have that asset, right? This process is complicated. It's very, very involved. And so having help, I think, is something that is very good, especially planning out 4 years, right? It feels like a long time, maybe feels like a short time, depending on where you are in high school right now too. Okay. Then, of course, the experiences, clinical research, shadowing, so on and so forth. And then knowing this medical application timeline. Like I said, you really have 3.5 years of undergrad to do everything that goes on to your ultimate primary medical application, right? And so in junior year, maybe for those of you who took the SAT, sometimes you can take the SAT in senior year or junior year, and you can use both of them. Whereas most students who apply to medical school, top medical schools, take the MCAT that junior year, right, for the first time. And so, going through this entire process, I know most of us here aren't seniors, but knowing this process of researching medical schools is much more involved, I think, than you'll expect. I was surprised by it this year, and I think maybe Dan can say the same. So just know that, it might seem straightforward. So you got to give that time, junior year to senior year, to start doing all of this process. While still maintaining all of your research, all of your clinical, all of your shadowing, all of your high GPA, so on, coursework, and clubs and such, right? And then, of course, same kind of idea. There are usually 2 applications. Usually you have a primary medical school application through the organization called AMCAS. I think it's Association of Medical Colleges, something. I can't remember. You can look it up, AMCAS. That's like the organization that does all of it. Kind of like the Common App in a sense, which is like what you use to apply to college for most schools. Okay, basic things. And then if the school, let's say if the school likes you, you would end up getting a secondary medical school application. I think most schools work that way. And you fill that out, and that's more additional questions. One thing about applying to college, I think that's a little bit different than this primary medical school application, is that usually when you apply to college now, top schools, they require quite a few essays, right? 4 or 5 essays, and you're writing for multiple schools. The primary medical school application usually is simply a personal statement. And you send that to all the different schools that you're applying to. And then that secondary application is when you get into more questions, more different responses, different kind of essay prompts that are shorter, but more in number. Okay. And then medical school interviews, huge. They always say, I think the 5, maybe 4 major things is your GPA, your MCAT, interviews, and then everything else kind of comes together. Experiences are probably depending on who you are and what you end up doing. So something to keep in, really keep in mind. These interviews are so much more important than what you'll see when you apply undergrad, because with undergrad, most of the interviews are like alumni interviews. So one of the students who had graduated from your particular school that you're applying to interviews you, perhaps, depending on what schools you're applying to. And that's more casual. That's more, have a conversation. Whereas this is big part of the application process, the admission process. And only a select few are even invited to an interview, and then you get accepted from that. And this is how BSMD works as well. Okay. Paying for medical school, big thing. Won't go into too much depth, but basically med schools are usually, total cost of attendance, $85,000 a year. And that's with tuition, with room and board, so on and so forth. And depends on where you live. It differs a little bit. Top undergrads are exactly like this, right? And so, I think the average debt of a medical school graduate is like $250,000. And so, yeah, it's quite, I think, startling in sitting here thinking about, well, I haven't had an income probably. Maybe you work at Target or something, but that big number, I think, is surprising to a lot of people. And you're paying interest on that. And then you have what we'll talk about is years of residency and perhaps fellowship, where you're making not what we consider a physician salary. I don't know. That's the verbiage I guess we'll use. Okay. And then you get to wait and hear back in senior year, the most fun part. So, okay. So what does medical school look like now? Of course, I think you have to expect that courses are going to be rigorous. It doesn't get easier. It's so selective for a reason because it requires a lot of you, a lot of energy, put in way more. And I think it's hard to conceptualize. I think as high school students, what that exactly looks like. But for some perspective, the first 2 years of medical school are usually your preclinical years. So that's where you're learning those fundamental sciences. You take, immunology. You learn what are the clinical skills that you'll eventually use in your third and fourth year, which we call the clinical clerkship years, where you start rotating with physicians, and you really start to take a medical history for a patient, how to have those conversations and actually do things. Maybe you've shadowed before, where you stand in the room, sit behind a physician, and they start having conversations with the patient. Well, flip it, you're the one who's having a conversation with a patient, taking that medical history, or whatever it is that in particular. It's by specialty usually, these clerkships. And so particularly to what you're doing, now that you've already learned those fundamental science skills, what the different pathologies are, different, what the physiology is and what the pathology is, and connecting those, and knowing all the diagnostic tests and so on and so forth, how to really treat a patient as we consider traditional medicine. And then now you're the one doing all of that in the third and fourth year. So I hope that's exciting for everyone in a sense, but it's also there's a lot that goes into that. Okay. One thing I thought that was interesting is that I mentioned is the grading. Many medical schools are pass fail in the preclinical years, whereas with the clinical clerkship you usually get like a ranking, like by quartile, by a certain percentile of your class. Do like honors, high honors, pass, so on and so forth. um, so and yeah, it's called pass. They call it like pass, high pass at some schools. I always thought that was interesting. Okay. Next thing about clinical clerkships is that the next step after medical school is applying to residency programs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's basically where you choose to go into a particular specialty and you train in that specialty. Okay. And when you do clerkships, part of the time that you're doing clerkships, you can go to different hospitals and do your clerkships. Okay. And different schools have different amount of weeks that you can do that. But that's big when it comes to the residency matching process. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more depth. But I thought, something gives you some perspective of how you're already preparing for that next step. And one thing is that you don't get summers. You don't get summers after you have your first, second year. In between, you get that summer, and then after that, you're usually doing clerkships during the other summers. But you have winter break, spring break for most medical schools. Okay. Next thing is the United States Medical Licensing Examination. There are 3 steps to the USMLE. The first 2 you take in medical school. The third we'll talk about you take in residency when you start. So the first step is basically how can you apply your foundational knowledge of preclinical information, right? So your immunology, your pathology, to clinical skills, to what that actually looks like. And this is a pass fail, but it's graded out of 300. You have to get a 194 out of 300 to pass. Give you some idea. But the pass rates for all of these exams are in the high 90% for all the steps. And you take this usually, I think, right after your preclinical years. So after your first and second year, depending on when your medical school finishes preclinical. Okay, because they're starting to shift toward pushing clinical clerkships earlier in your 4 years of medical school. So it might be right after your first year, you take that USMLE step 1, for example, or after your second year. Okay, USMLE step 2 is clinical knowledge. That's that CK there. Concept, how are you, what knowledge do you have about actually being in, working with a patient, having those conversations, taking a medical history is the example I'm going to use for clinical in all these cases. And of course, there's a lot more involved that you can look into if you want to look into that at this point. But again, you're prepared, of course, because of medical school. It's built for you to be ready for that. And the pass rate's very high. And then on top of all that, researching and having other extracurriculars is still a big part of medical school, just like it is maybe for you in high school now or in undergrad, for sure in undergrad, going through this traditional process. And of course, you have less time because the structure, the way medical school works, you're spending a lot of time actually learning medicine and going through this, process of the curriculum. Okay. So residency, right? Basically, the simple concept is you do another X amount of years. It varies depending on specialty, where you get trained in a specialty that you want to pursue and that you want to basically practice for the rest of your life. Whether that means maybe you want to go into cardiology, pulmonology, ENT, internal medicine, family practice. So there are different residencies for different specialties, and some are exceptions to that. Some specialties, like allergy and immunology, for example, doesn't have a direct residency. You have to go through it's called a subspecialty technically. And so we'll talk about that next. That's called fellowship. So I want to show you this process, right? The way you apply and get admitted to undergrad and medical school is, I think, makes sense to most of you, right? The way it works is you send in your application, right? And then, maybe you get an interview and then you get admitted or you don't. Okay. The way that residency matching, it all goes through this NRMP, the National Residency Matching Program, which is an algorithm that matches you with the school, with a program. Okay. So before I open this video, does anyone have any questions about anything we talked about? I know that was long-winded. There's a lot of steps. Look at my chat. Okay, I hope that means this is thorough. Can you hear that? Okay, let me stop sharing again. Can you hear it now? Let me turn the volume up.
The NRMP uses a computerized mathematical algorithm to place applicants into residency and fellowship positions. At NRMP, we call it the matching algorithm, as we use it to match applicants to their most preferred programs. The algorithm is...
Let me interject really quick. So when we talk about residency programs, these are at hospitals. It's not like you go to a school and you do residency. You go to a particular hospital, usually affiliated with a school. But so when they're going to talk about matching to a program, you'll have a hospital that has the program, not a school. So just not to confuse anyone. Okay.
Applicant proposing, meaning it initiates placement of an applicant into a program based on the choices made on the applicant's rank order list, and not a program's rank order list. However, for a match to occur, both the applicant and program must rank each other. Once started, the algorithm attempts to match each applicant to the applicant's first choice. If that can't be guaranteed, the algorithm will try to match the applicant to the second choice, and so on, until the applicant is matched or all choices have been exhausted. Let's run a match to see how it works. 5 applicants, Arthur, Sunny, Joseph, Latha, and Darius, and 3 programs, Mercy, City, and General, have submitted rank order lists. Each program has 2 openings. Starting with Arthur, we see he ranked only City. Because the algorithm is applicant proposing, it will attempt to match Arthur to City. City has ranked Arthur second, and because there are no other tentative matches for City, Arthur is tentatively matched to City. Matches are considered tentative because an applicant who is matched to a program at one point in the matching process may be removed from the program later to make space for an applicant ranked higher by the program. Sunny also ranks City first, and the algorithm attempts to match her there. City ranks Sunny third. Because City has 1 opening left, Sunny is tentatively matched to City. Joseph also ranks City first. The algorithm attempts to match Joseph to City, but because both openings are tentatively matched to higher ranked applicants, Joseph can't match at City. The algorithm now attempts to match Joseph to his second ranked program, General. General has ranked Joseph third, and since there are no tentative matches for General yet, Joseph is tentatively matched to General. Latha ranked Mercy first, but Mercy didn't rank Latha, so she can't match there. The algorithm moves to her second rank, City. City has ranked Latha, but City already has its 2 positions filled with more preferred applicants. She cannot match with City. The algorithm attempts to match Latha to her third rank, General, which has 1 unfilled position, so Latha tentatively matches with General. Finally, the algorithm attempts to match Darius. Darius is ranked City first, and City has ranked Darius first. Darius receives a confirmed match because he's the applicant most preferred by City. There's no chance he will be displaced later in the process. However, since City has only 2 openings, an applicant must be removed from City to make room for Darius. That applicant is Sunny, because she is the least preferred applicant on City's rank order list. The algorithm will now attempt to match Sunny to her second rank, Mercy. Mercy hasn't ranked Sunny, so she does not match to any program. The process is now complete, and the match is final. All applicants except Sunny have matched to their most preferred choices possible. Although all of Sunny's choices have been attempted, she didn't match at City because Darius and Arthur were ranked higher by City, and she couldn't match at Mercy because Mercy didn't rank her at all. City in general filled all of their positions, but Mercy is left with both positions unfilled. Mercy didn't use the match to its advantage because it submitted a short rank order list. Joseph, Latha, and Darius used the match to their advantage by ranking all acceptable programs at which they interviewed in their preferred order to maximize their chances of matching. Arthur took a real risk by ranking only City. Data showed that applicants with short lists have a higher likelihood of being unmatched. Remember, a match commitment is binding, which means an applicant is obligated to accept the position and begin training if a match occurs. To learn more about the matching algorithm, visit the NRMP website.
Alrighty. So that's the general idea of how the match works, and you'll see it's quite different than how you'd imagine the med school or the undergrad process to work. Let me show again. Okay. So I think the interesting thing is that schools rank you and you rank schools, right? That's the basis idea. How do you get high on that ranking list for the school is the question. So when you finish medical school, or when you're finishing medical school, let's say, you talk to these schools and you interview at these schools, well, I keep saying schools, but these residency programs. And you'll meet with the admissions faculty who is deciding who gets to the program, what that list looks like, that numbered list for the school, what they're picking. And that's one of the main ways that that residency list for that school is made, how you get your name over there, right? Because if they have no idea who you are, then you probably won't, end up on the list. And the second thing is that initial point about the clerkships, the away clerkships, that allow you to go to a particular hospital and do your clerkship there. And that is one thing that gets your name into that program. You'd probably do a clerkship at a place that you want to go, or you're considering going for residency, right? So that is kind of the idea of the NRMP, how the NRMP works, and how residency is matched. Okay. So again, the idea is that there are many different specialties that you can do in residency. You can do, for example, you have a neurosurgery residency. That I believe is a 7-year program. That's one of the longest programs. You have ENT, you have ophthalmology, you have internal medicine, you have family practice, you have internal medicine / pediatrics. There are some combined programs. You have dermatology, and all of them differ in the length of the program. And usually it's 3 to 7 years. If across all the programs, it's in that range. So the idea is that now you are within what they call the attending physician now. And that's someone who basically oversees and trains you, and there's someone in the specialty that you're training to go into, of course, which is very different than what sitting in a classroom and listening to lectures is, right? Because now you are you're a physician. You have that MD degree. You're not fully licensed yet. You don't have that USMLE step 3 until you get through the middle of residency, as you can see there. But you are actually practicing medicine. You're going through this process of learning your specialty very well. Okay. Then the way residency is broken down, they sometimes refer to the first year as internship. And that applies no matter what residency you're in. They just call the first year after medical school that you're in a residency program the internship year. After this first year, it doesn't matter how long your residency program is, that first year is called internship usually. And after that first year, you'll be taking that third step of the United States medical licensing exam. And this is the final thing that gives you your medical license to practice medicine in the country. Okay. And you can see the pass number there, 188 out of 300. Again, these pass rates are like 95+%. So very, very high. Okay. Next thing is board certification. So there's two things. You can finish your residency and you're in a particular specialty and you're done after your years of residency. Or you can do something called subspecialize or go into a subspecialty. If you just do your residency and you're done after that, which many people do, depending on what specialty you're in, it just depends on what you pursue. You'll take the boards for your state, the board exams. And this is what really allows you, you certify yourself and you put that, as part of your, when you apply to jobs, you put that you're board certified and you're board certified in a particular specialty. So let's say you're in nephrology, you're board certified in nephrology and in Illinois, for example. And that's something that it gives you that reputation that's kind of like the gold standard in addition to the medical licensing exam. Okay, in addition to just the license to practice medicine. All right. The next thing is this concept of subspecializing, which is called fellowship. So let's say you went into cardiology. That was your residency program. And you say, well, cardiologists do XYZ. They usually have maybe more clinical interactions. And you want to say, I want to do more surgery-based cardiology. Okay. So there you can do a fellowship in something called interventional cardiology, where you end up doing more procedures, still being in cardiology, but in a very specific niche area where not all cardiologists do that. It's only interventional cardiologists. And there's interventional medicine for almost all of the different specialties. And so you have to do this extra time, extra years, usually 1 to 3 years, depending on what you're subspecializing in, to end up practicing in that area. So one thing that I want to mention also is if you do you might have heard of some specialties that are technically, by this metric, subspecialties, like nephrology, allergy immunology, rheumatology. All of these things actually require, there's no residency for them. You would do a residency in internal medicine and then do a fellowship in those particular areas. And you can do a fellowship after that to be even more subspecialized. If you remember, one of our physicians who came in, the general surgeon who came in, said he subspecialized in particularly doing breast cancer surgeries, right? So there's a lot that you can do later on if you want to do a fellowship after, but just that idea of, you're narrowing down exactly what you want to do, right? And you're being trained in that area. And usually medical school, when you're doing those clerkships, you get an idea of what you want to pursue. Okay. Again, board certification, you do it after. NRMP, the same process is used for matching to fellowships. Okay. I'm going to give a brief list. I think I'm taking way too long to go over a lot of the stuff that I'm saying today, but we'll skim over these lists. Here's just a list of all the straight residency programs. That means after medical school, you apply to these residency programs. You can have an idea of the length of training that each takes, right? So neurosurgery is the longest one at 7 years. And just to give you some perspective. Okay. Won't go into too much depth, I know. Okay. Next thing is the fellowship programs. This is just a brief list. I think I'm gonna post this slide set so you can see there's a full list I linked at the bottom here. But for example, if you want to, so this is the one I wanted to mention is internal medicine. Here, if you you've seen physicians in these fields, okay? You think of them maybe as a specialist, but in the process of going into this career, they went through an internal medicine residency and then did a fellowship in these particular areas. Okay. Whereas you have some people who, what you'd consider a specialist, like in pediatrics, and they go into these fellowships if they so choose. All right. And then again, length of years there. You can see a full list if you're interested in looking at that. I'll post it. Okay. And now we got to the end of all of that, very long. When I was making this, I was like so anxious. I was like, oh my gosh, how many years of this is this gonna be? One thing I should mention is that you start having an income in residency and in fellowship. I think the average is like 60,000 per year is the annual salary, and it's been going up because of like legislation and stuff. But then you finish all this, you finish your specialized, subspecialized, whatever the heck you're doing, and then you get to apply for a job and interview for a job, and whatever that means for you, whether you go into hospital, whether you go into private practice. Um, it's depends on what you're doing, right? And so I'm sure you've heard. I hope this kind of puts together. We've had a lot of physicians and a lot of different healthcare professionals talk about what the process is, but let's say for physicians, because we just talked about, kind of makes more sense when we talk about this lengthy process, right, and what's involved. Okay, now Dan, I'll take over. Just let me know when you want me to click the next slide. Actually, let me see if I can give you control. Okay, forget it. Just tell me when to click the next slide and we're good. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, go ahead. So first, we're going to cover nursing, and she did a really good job covering becoming a physician. And I know for many of you, becoming a physician might be very enticing, but nursing is also a very good option, especially if you do not want to spend quite as much time in becoming a physician. It is still a great way to become involved in healthcare, and nurses certainly take a very active role. So in high school, for all of these careers that we're going to be discussing today, um, it's a similar track. So you start learning about healthcare. As Rishi mentioned before, it's important to be open-minded with all of the extracurriculars and all of the courses you take, so you truly find your interests. But make sure you volunteer, shadow physicians, nurses, and so on, and enjoy your science courses and explore other courses of your interest too. Um, it's really important to figure out why you're pursuing nursing rather than anything else, or else you will get worn out by the rigor, of the academics in your future. And after that, just apply to nursing programs, or you can even just go to regular undergrad, get a bachelor in something else, and then if you decide later to come back to nursing, you can also do that, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So generally, a nurse practitioner, for those of you who don't know, diagnose and treat patients with different illnesses. Often they specialize in certain fields, such as pediatrics or mental health. I'll mention a few later on. And these professionals evaluate patients to determine treatment options and educate others on methods for avoiding sickness. Go ahead. Slide. Okay. So next, what you want to do in undergraduate is, if you want to just go directly to nursing, if you're committed, complete your bachelor's degree in nursing, which is called a BSN. This is required, unlike for medical school where you can major in anything, right, or get a bachelor in anything and still go to medical school. This is required even if you have a bachelor in something else, such as biology, biochem, stuff like that. But if you do get a bachelor in something else, you may be eligible for an accelerated bachelor's in nursing program, and also those with only associate's degrees in nursing are also eligible for these programs. Okay. So next, after you complete your bachelor's, you have to pass the National Council licensure exam, which tests knowledge and critical thinking skills. A license is required for each state, so you apply to it by your state or the state you intend on working in. And you must contact the nursing regulatory system in your state to receive an authorization to test. And then after that, you apply for your nursing license. And once you do that, it works for mostly lower level nurses. You have your license, but if you want to become like a nurse practitioner or an advanced nurse, you need to enroll in a graduate program. So there's one of two ways to go about this. You can get a master's of science in nursing or a doctorate in nursing practice. Generally, if you get a master's in science and nursing, it's good for like those who wish to specialize clinically in fields such as pediatrics and wish to work at a hospital. But if you wish to become a higher level administrator or to do higher level tasks, you should go for the doctorate in nursing practice. And I know I haven't really mentioned like timelines much, but it really varies depending on the program you go to and depending on the graduate on the degrees you get. But I've heard that the bachelor's programs and the master's can be finished in as little as 18 months online. But if you go to a physical school, it would probably take longer, like 2 years, I would say, and 1 year for master's. And then after that, you select your population focus or your field of focus. And I'll name a few that I found on our website really quick. There's adult gerontology, acute care, where you provide care to adolescents. Acute care means short-term diseases that aren't chronic, long-going. Adults and elderly. Adult gerontology, same thing, except provide advanced primary care to them. Family nurse practitioner, neonatal, where you provide advanced care to premature and ill newborns, pediatric, where you care for newborns, infants, toddlers, adolescents, and young adults. And then you can narrow further based on that. Psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, women's health nurse practitioner, and so on. There are just so many ways to specialize, and it's really important to figure out where you're most strongly inclined. And lastly, to become a nurse practitioner, you have to pass the national board exam, National Nurse Practitioner Board exam, and apply for initial nurse practitioner licensure in state, as mentioned before, and license must be renewed every so often.
I'm going to jump in really quick. Does anyone have any questions? I know I didn't ask at the end of the medical, but anything about nursing or being a physician before we jump into the last brief part? Alrighty, go ahead, Dan.
So now another attractive option, especially nowadays, is becoming a physician assistant. I personally know a few people who are en route to becoming a physician assistant, and she's taking her test in September. I wish her the best of luck. So, but this job is highly flexible. It is well paid, and they're in demand. So for our generation, it's certainly a very, very enticing option, since you get to have almost as high of authority as a doctor, but it's not nearly as much schooling or work, and you still get very well paid. So, and in high school, similarly to nursing and becoming a physician, you want to start learning about healthcare, discover your interests, again, be open-minded about all of the courses you take, all the opportunities you take, except make sure that some of them at least will benefit you in the long run. Volunteer, shadow, and so on, and form connections, like Rishi said. Look around in your community, Talk to people, reach out to teachers, because you never know who they may know too. And yeah, enjoy your science courses and other courses. Don't neglect those. And really figure out why you're interested in pursuing becoming a physician assistant, because while this is certainly a flexible option compared to becoming a physician, it's still very rigorous. It's still going to be a very hard few years of your life if you're going through this school. So make sure you are genuinely interested in that. Then, through that, apply to undergrad schools. So, undergrad and college, you want to obtain a bachelor's degree. And this isn't as strict, I guess, as nursing, but yeah, so explore your interest to your greatest extent. Yeah. So make sure while you explore your interest, you also complete all the prerequisite courses that are required for your intended PA program. Some of them differ, but and even though this is important to note, as it came up in my research, even though a college may only have certain course requirements, it's important to note that your PA program may have different requirements in the college. So make sure to talk to your advisor about that when you get there. And very importantly, for becoming a PA, you need to complete healthcare experience and patient care experience hours. These are two separate things, and I'll talk about them to a great extent now. So, in my research, I discovered that all future PAs need healthcare experience. PA programs look for two types, as I mentioned before: healthcare experience, abbreviated HCE, and patient care experience, PCE. So, healthcare experience is work in which you are not directly responsible for a patient's care, while a patient care experience is when you're directly responsible for it. So it'd be best to obtain these types of experiences as early as you can in your undergraduate years, but some future PAs, much like medical school students, have decided to take a gap year so they can get all of the hours that they need, because it is a hefty requirement. Usually, PA programs require at least 1,000 HCE or PCE hours. Yeah, a lot. And every program is different, however, but minimum requirements can be found on each PA school's website. And here, we should mention, like for medical school, use the AMCAS for all of your applications, and high school use the Common App generally. But PA schools have this thing called the CASPA, or the Centralized Application Service for Physician Assistants. And once you have your bachelor's degree and you've acquired a good amount of hours of HCE and PCE, you need to start preparing your application. So you'll likely use CASPA to apply, and you'll need undergraduate or postgraduate transcripts. You need to get these early in the process. And as Rishi mentioned, for medical school, you need letters of recommendation. It's important to get all of your connections. So yeah, make sure you reach out to all of your teachers, and that you do shadowing and other extracurricular opportunities in your undergraduate community, and form strong bonds with those people, because they can help you get very far. So typically, these are from professors, supervisors, physicians, and of course, other people who are already PAs. And with these, PA programs can gain insight into your character, your work ethic, and overall intelligence and integrity. And of course, you need a list of all of your HCE and PCE hours. You'll have to differentiate between them. And again, like Risha mentioned, for medical school, it's pretty similar. For your CASPA, you need a personal statement rather than like a whole bunch of other essays at first, which is a 5,000 character essay highlighting why you have chosen to become a PA and why you should be considered for the PA program of your choice. So it's a really important part of telling your story and of convincing admissions that you are a worthy candidate. Go on. So next, you enroll in a PA program, granted if you are accepted into one, and get ready for course rigor, because I heard a site said, and I quote, "It'll be the hardest 23 to 27 months of your life." So yeah, it's flexible, but it's no joke. It's hard. So and once you get into the PA school, you'll eventually have to pass the PANCE, which stands for the Physician Assistant National Certifying Exam, which is a 5-hour long test consisting of 300 total questions. And passing the PANCE is the final step to becoming a PA. And after that, congratulations. All that's left to do is to find a job and start practicing all that you learned in PA school. Very rewarding profession that benefits many on a daily basis. So it's a really good job. But go on. And while we cover, oh yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, while we covered a lot of different, I mean, not a lot, 3 main different careers today, to some extent. As you can see, there are a ton of other careers. So these are by no means your only options. Go ahead, Rishi.
Yeah, that's important. I know we went like an hour, which is longer than I was anticipating. I think I went very long with that. I apologize. I usually try to shoot for a little bit less. So yeah, there are many other careers that there are to talk about. Obviously, we couldn't cram everything into today because these are long processes. And like Dan said, I think the most important thing is that if you love what you do, right, it's going to be the most rewarding process that you're going to go through. And I think it's intimidating when we go through it sometimes. I know I get intimidating by it, and I'm like very excited, as you might hear me sometimes. But it's that level of you are going to make it if you put the time and the effort, because it's what you want to do, right? Whatever that is. Maybe it's not in healthcare. I know we are FHP. But I think it's really important to have that broad perspective of what you want to do, and don't feel like you have to do something or you have to do something else because either someone tells you to, or you think for maybe financial reasons you should do something. I think that's really important to appreciate when you look at, what do I want to do that'll make me happy every day going into work. When you walk into, maybe it's the clinic, maybe it's a cubicle, maybe it's the restaurant, or whatever you're doing, to find that the process is going to be the process for the particular field that you're going into, to know it is good and to understand what you're getting into, right? And I think the little bit of uncertainty is okay. You might feel like, I see what I would need to do, it looks scary. You might be afraid of it, but feeling comfortable with that level of uncertainty, I think is something that's everyone goes through. I'm sure if you talk to a lot of physicians, and maybe you should ask this, when we hear some physicians speak, is like they did not know what they were going into 100%, right? And they probably were not 100% confident about it either. You guys are more prepared than I think most people in high school about what the heck is going on in healthcare. At least that's based on my general consensus of how people think. So I hope you found that interesting. Oh, we're having a PA on Thursday. Come in at 4 p.m. So I think if you have questions about that, PA and nursing are growing so much. And I think when we end up in the career of whatever area in healthcare, I think that's something that we'll see hugely. So for those of you interested in PA or nursing, just that's amazing. I think it really is phenomenal. And I think with the way culture is, we always seem to kind of put physicians at some other level, but it's really, the PAs and NPs that do everything. And increasingly more so because it comes down to the physician wanting to do, especially older generations, physicians doing less, and then the PAs and NPs taking over and doing a lot of the actual hands-on medicine, which hopefully for you, that's the fun part. Maybe it's not. Maybe you like something else. But if it is, then I think that that's something phenomenal. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about anything we kind of went through today, or anything that we didn't go over? You could talk maybe, or about, maybe the college admissions process too, if you're thinking about that. Nothing? Alrighty. Well, then I hope you prepare some questions then for our PA coming in. And maybe you'll find that interesting too, because they are very experienced, much more than any of us can, we of course attest to. Okay. I want to say again, enjoy the weather, please go out. And we will see you Thursday. Bye everyone.
Thank you.